The incident I am about to share today was told to me by a man named Richard. By profession, he is an environmental field researcher for a state agency. My introduction to him was rather peculiar. It happened about a month ago. I was standing in front of Portland Medical Center in Maine for some official work. Suddenly, I noticed a gentleman standing near a pharmacy, talking frantically on his phone. He held a thick file in his hand, and beads of sweat covered his forehead, even though the weather was freezing. I overheard him pleading into the phone, "Look, I can't take a posting in that flooded region again. You can let me go if you have to, but I am never going back to that lake area." His words struck me as odd. Out of curiosity, I stepped closer to him. Later, we properly introduced ourselves over coffee at a nearby diner. At first, Richard was very hesitant to talk about the incident. He kept dodging the subject. After I fully introduced myself and assured him I would listen, he said, "People don't believe these things. They'll just call me crazy." The dark circles under his eyes and his withered appearance made it clear he was going through severe trauma or stress. The incident took place at Blackwood Lake, a remote flooded valley where Richard had been sent for an environmental survey project. I am recounting the story in Richard's exact words. Please forgive any unintentional errors. Richard begins. It was December of last year. As you know, winter arrives early in the isolated lake regions of the Northeast, and the cold is brutally intense. My posting was in a very remote lakeside town. There was barely any electricity at the time, and getting a cellular signal was nearly impossible. Everywhere you looked, it was just water and more water, with small patches of land looking like isolated islands. The house I was boarding in was a dilapidated cabin right at the edge of the woods. The caretaker of the property was a man named Hank. He must have been in his 50s. He was a very poor but incredibly honest man. He spent his days fishing on his skiff and would run into town at night to get my groceries. It happened one day during a new moon. The locals didn't look favorably upon those pitch-black nights. You know how rural environments can be, how steeped they are in superstition. The local folks were highly suspicious of the dark. The elders heavily forbade going out on the water. They claimed there was a bad wind over the lake. They said strange lights could be seen out there late at night, and that the sound of crying echoed from beneath the water. I am a rational man. I got my master's degree in sociology from Boston University, so I never let these myths or superstitions get to me. That evening, the weather became incredibly suffocating. The fog rolled in so thick that if you reached your hand out, it felt like it would disappear into the darkness. I was sitting in my room, working on some project reports on my laptop. I had a kerosene lantern burning, but its light seemed to be strangely dimming. Suddenly, Hank came to my window and called out, "Sir, I don't think I'll go out on the lake tonight. My body doesn't feel right." I replied, "If you don't go, how will you eat, Hank? Tomorrow is supply day." Hank stayed quiet for a moment and then said, "Yeah, sir. Plus, tomorrow is Christmas Eve. The demand for fish will be high. I got a family to feed. Sometimes you just gotta take the risk." I didn't say anything else. He wrapped a tattered flannel jacket tightly around himself, grabbed his lantern and casting net, and faded into the darkness. I went back to my work, but for some reason, a deep unease settled in my chest. There was absolute silence, save for the drip, drop of dew falling on the tin roof. Occasionally, the distant howl of a coyote echoed, making the atmosphere feel incredibly eerie and unsettling. As the night deepened, I started feeling sleepy. I was just getting ready for bed when, suddenly, I heard an unearthly scream coming from the direction of the lake. It was a human voice, but it was laced with so much terror and panic that the hair on my arms stood up. I grabbed my flashlight and sprinted out of the cabin. I saw a few other locals rushing toward the docks with their lanterns. A few moments later, Hank's skiff bumped against the wooden pier, but the boat wasn't floating naturally. It looked as if something had forcefully shoved it toward the shore. Hank was huddled in the hull of the boat, curled up like a living corpse. His eyes were completely sunken, and his body was trembling violently. A few of us carried him up onto the dry land. No words were coming out of his mouth. He was just shaking and pointing a trembling finger toward the bottom of the boat. I shined my flashlight into the hull of the skiff. I was entirely unprepared for what I saw. There was a fish lying there, a massive one, easily 12 to 15 pounds, though I hesitate to even call it a fish. Its body was pitch black, as if coated in thick tar. The most horrifying part was that it had no scales. Instead, its skin was rough and textured, exactly like badly burned human flesh. But what terrified me the most were its eyes. Fish don't have eyes like that. When the beam of my flashlight hit it, I swear it was looking straight into my eyes. I had never seen so much malice and pure hatred in the eyes of a dead creature. A foul, putrid stench was radiating from its body. It smelled exactly like rotting meat or a decaying corpse. The smell was so bad I nearly vomited. We managed to get Hank to drink some water, and he eventually regained a bit of his senses.
He spoke in a broken, shivering voice. "Sir, I didn't know," he trembled. "I didn't know it wasn't a fish." I asked, "What happened, Hank? Why are you so terrified?" Hank swallowed hard and said, "After I threw the net, I didn't even realize it had gotten heavy. Felt like something grabbed it from the bottom and pulled. When I finally dragged it up with all my might, I saw it. But even after pulling it into the boat, it was moving, sir. It was staring right at me. Its eyes were like a man's." My heart almost stopped from the fear. He paused, struggling to breathe. I could clearly see him gasping for air. I rubbed his back to comfort him. He whispered, and then I heard it, sir. Someone calling me from under the black water. It wasn't a human voice, sir. It sounded like a snake whispering through the wind. The voice was saying. Hank squeezed his eyes shut as if the sound was still echoing in his skull. He muttered that terrifying phrase, "Give it back. Give my thing back. Give it back." I tried to rationalize. "Hank, your mind is playing tricks on you. It was probably just the wind." He suddenly grabbed my wrist. His hand was freezing, as cold as ice. "No, sir, it wasn't a trick." Then the boat started rocking violently. Felt like hands coming up from the deep, grabbing the edges, trying to flip me over. I paddled for my life, but I couldn't fight the greed. That's why I didn't throw it back. It was then I noticed Hank's legs were covered in mud, but the skin right above his ankle was scraped. Dark, blackish blood was oozing from the wound. I assumed he had just scraped it against the wooden edge of the boat. Had I known what actually caused that mark, we would have burned that monstrosity to ashes that very night. Hank took the ketch and headed back to his room. The rest of us returned to our cabins, but sleep evaded me entirely. The gaze of those glowing yellow eyes kept flashing in my mind, and that putrid stench, it felt like it was lingering in the air of my room. That night I had a bizarre nightmare. I dreamt I was standing in the middle of the Black Lake, and thousands of dark, rotting hands were rising from the water, reaching out for me. The next morning, I was jolted awake by the sound of Hank's wife screaming and sobbing. I scrambled out of bed and ran outside. A crowd of locals had already gathered in Hank's yard. Hank was lying on a woven mat on his front porch. He was buried under several heavy blankets, yet he was shivering violently as if freezing. His wife saw me and wailed, "Oh, sir, look what happened to my man. He was fine last night. Since the early hours, his body has been burning like a furnace, but his hands and feet are like ice." I stepped closer and placed my hand on his forehead. His skin truly felt like solid ice, yet he was sweating profusely. He was delirious with fever, muttering incoherently. But listening closely, it sounded like he was witnessing something horrifying. He kept whispering, "They're coming. They smell the blood. Lock the door. Lock the door." I turned to his wife and asked, "Did you folks eat that fish last night?" The terrified woman replied, "No, sir. I went to chop it up, but when I brought the cleaver down on its belly, no blood came out, just this thick black tar, and the smell was unnatural. I was too scared to cook it. Your friend Hank buried it out back in the yard." I felt a wave of relief, knowing they hadn't ingested anything venomous. I figured the freezing lake weather had given him severe pneumonia or hypothermia. I said, "Don't worry, I'll call the county dispatcher in town and get a doctor out here." But before any medical help could be arranged, Hank's condition rapidly deteriorated by noon, and that was when we noticed the truly horrifying detail. Hank's right ankle, the exact spot where I saw the scrape the night before, had swollen and turned a sickly, blackish green. I leaned in for a closer look, and my breath caught in my throat. It wasn't a normal scrape. There were 3 distinct puncture wounds, but they weren't square like human teeth. They were perfectly triangular and razor sharp, like the bite of a savage deep woods beast. The flesh around the bite was necrotizing, rotting into a dark, gangrenous green. Hank suddenly convulsed in agony. Thick foam began spilling from his lips. I rushed forward to pin him down so he wouldn't hurt himself, but I had no idea a sick, malnourished man could possess such terrifying strength. He threw me off with a single violent twitch. His eyes rolled entirely into the back of his head, leaving only the whites visible. And then he spoke. The voice that came out of him could not possibly belong to Hank. It was impossibly deep, guttural and raspy, like someone speaking from 6 feet under the earth. Hearing that voice tear through Hank's throat, everyone on the porch backed away in sheer terror.
The entity residing inside him twisted Hank's face into a sinister grin and said, "Since you took it, a price must be paid. Blood. I want my blood. I need blood." I shuddered uncontrollably. These were no normal symptoms of a fever or infection. Hank's wife fainted on the spot. I had no idea what to do. My limbs felt numb. My rational mind desperately searched for logic. Maybe it was tetanus.
a venomous snake bite causing severe hallucinations. But deep within my core, a primal, ancient fear had awakened. That afternoon, the locals brought in an old spiritualist, a demonologist named Elias who lived on the edge of the county. Elias took one look at Hank and his expression turned stone cold. He stared into Hank's rolled back eyes and flinched. He leaned in and whispered to me, "Son, taking him to a hospital won't do a damn thing. What's got a hold of him is something dark, an ancient curse of the deep water. Keep your guard up. The hours ahead are going to be wicked." Elias left us with some purified water and departed, but Hank's condition didn't improve. Instead, as night fell, the atmosphere shifted entirely. Right after sunset, the environment turned utterly hostile. We could hear the sound of heavy rain pelting the tin roof, but when I looked outside, it was bone dry. Then came the heavy, dragging footsteps above us. Scrape, scrape, and that same putrid, metallic stench of rotting meat and rusted iron we smelled on the fish filled the room, growing thicker by the minute. I sat down next to Hank's bed. The kerosene lantern flickered wildly. Hank suddenly gripped my hand with bone-crushing force. His eyes were somewhat normal again, but filled with absolute, nightmarish terror. He whispered, "Sir, don't look at the window. He's sitting there. He's watching me." Against my better judgment, I looked at the window. Outside was pitch-black darkness, but through the rusted grates, I clearly saw two glowing, yellow eyes staring back. Exactly like the eyes of that monstrosity in the boat. My throat went completely dry. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. I blinked, and the shadow vanished. But the lingering dread remained. Hank began desperately muttering a prayer to God, begging for protection, but he kept stumbling over the words. It looked as if an invisible hand was clamping down over his mouth. As the night deepened, his body temperature plummeted further. It felt like he was slowly turning into a block of solid ice. Then I heard it. A sickening noise coming from directly beneath the wooden floorboards. Or maybe inside the walls. It sounded like long claws frantically scratching at the wood. Scratch, scratch, scratch. The noise was so unnerving it made my teeth grind together. Suddenly, Hank's body arched off the bed like a drawn bow. He let out an ear-piercing, unearthly shriek. The few of us in the room lunged to hold him down, but his skin was now boiling hot. The room was freezing, but a hellfire seemed to be burning inside him. It was a terrifying sight. The way his spine bent, I thought his back was going to snap in half. 3 grown men couldn't keep him pinned. He possessed the strength of a demon. The worst part was that as he foamed at the mouth, he began savagely biting through his own lips. Blood and saliva mixed, running down his chin. After 5 agonizing minutes, the seizure abruptly stopped. He collapsed onto the mattress, completely drained of life. I checked his pulse. His heart was hammering so hard I thought it would burst through his rib cage. No one slept that night. I sat vigil by his head until dawn. When morning broke, he regained consciousness, but he didn't recognize anyone. He just stared blankly at the ceiling, as if watching a horror play out in another dimension. First thing in the morning, I called my friend Dr. Aaron, who practices in Boston. I explained everything in detail, especially the unnatural bite mark on the ankle. He was silent for a long time. Finally, he said, Man, what you're describing, there's no medical explanation for that. Triangular bite marks, sudden freezing of the core temperature, that doesn't line up with gangrene or animal bites. You need to medevac him to a major trauma center in Boston or Portland immediately. Local clinics can't handle whatever that is. I hung up the phone, feeling utterly defeated. Transporting a man in his condition from this isolated swamp was practically impossible. And worse, Hank's wife adamantly refused to let him leave. She kept repeating, "It's a dark spirit. Doctors can't fix a cursed soul." Around noon, an elderly local, Old Man Miller, came to check on us. He was well over 80 but still sharp and tough. He walked in, took a long look at the rotting wound on Hank's ankle, and let out a heavy sigh. He looked at me and said, "Son, you're educated. You're from the city. You probably think I'm crazy."
But that ain't no animal bite. That's the old curse. "What do you know about this, Mr. Miller?" I asked. Old Man Miller leaned against the wooden porch pillar. A deep shadow of fear crossed his wrinkled face. He pulled out a pouch of chewing tobacco, packed his lip, and began to recall a story from the past. I will tell the rest of the history in Old Man Miller's exact words. Miller begins. "It was right after the war. I was just a young buck. Like Hank, I loved heading out on the water. Used to fish these lakes with my paw. There was a local boy named Robert, brave kid but greedy to a fault. One night he took his skiff out into the deep waters. It was a pitch-black new moon, just like the other night. When Robert came back, his nets were empty of fish, but he was holding this heavy, strange black stone, shaped a bit like a fish, but solid rock. He claimed he found an underwater palace down in the deep and brought the stone back from it. We begged him to throw it back, told him to dump it in the lake, but he wouldn't listen. After that night, Robert went through the exact same hell Hank is going through. First the fever, then the crazy talk. Kept saying voices were calling him from the bottom of the lake, coming to collect him. 3 days later, Robert's body just dried up, like a husk. Looked like every drop of blood was sucked clean out of his veins. And the scariest part, son? The night before he died, we stood outside his cabin and heard whispers. Sounded like a dozen people inside his room having a quiet meeting. But Robert was in there all alone. Before he passed, Robert grabbed my paw's arm. His voice didn't sound human no more. He said, "They used me as bait, Paw. They don't want my meat, they want my soul. They smell the blood, and they won't stop now." Next morning, we found him. Wasn't even a corpse, looked more like a mummy. Not a drop of moisture left in him. And that black stone he brought back? Gone. Someone, or something, tore a hole right through the wooden wall and took it back. Seeing Hank today, it brings all that nightmare from 50 years ago right back. The symptoms are the same, just a different poor soul. Old Man Miller fell silent. Hearing his story sent an icy chill down my spine. My logical mind desperately wanted to rationalize everything, but witnessing the exact same horrors unfold before my eyes made it impossible to deny. The afternoon faded into dusk, and as soon as the sun dipped below the tree line, the oppressive, suffocating dread returned. Hank's condition crashed suddenly. He had been catatonic all day, but as soon as the evening shadows stretched, he began thrashing violently. I rushed into his room. I held a glass of water to his mouth, but he refused to drink.
Suddenly, his hand shot out and clamped around my wrist. His fingernails dug deep into my flesh. I gasped in pain. When I looked down at his face, I froze in sheer terror. Hank's pupils were no longer dark. They had turned a sickening, glowing yellow, exactly like the eyes of the beast from the lake. He stared up at me and smiled. There was zero humanity left in that smile. It was pure, unadulterated malice. Then he spoke in a voice that made my blood run cold. It couldn't belong to a human, let alone Hank. It was a dual voice, a deep, guttural growl overlapping with a high, hissing screech underneath it, like two entities speaking through one throat. The thing possessing Hank stared right through me and snarled. "Called a doctor? Useless. We're taking him with us. It's been so long since we tasted fresh blood. Did you think we'd let him go?" I stumbled backward in fear. The glass slipped from my hand and shattered loudly on the floorboards. In the corner of the room, Hank's wife and young daughter huddled together, weeping in terror. I gathered every ounce of courage I had and shouted, "Who are you? Why are you torturing him?" In response, Hank, or whatever was wearing his skin, snapped his head sharply to the right. A sickening crack of bone echoed in the room. It hissed. "Who am I? I am the master of the lake. You stepped into my domain. You stole my property. And now you refuse to pay? My price is blood. Just like you pay with paper, I deal in blood. You will give me your blood." The moment the words left his mouth, the candle in the room violently blew out. Darkness swallowed us entirely, and in that pitch-black void, I clearly heard heavy thuds hitting the tin roof above us. Thump, thump, like massive wet bodies leaping onto the house. I fumbled for my phone and flicked on the flashlight. The beam hit the bed and I flinched. Hank wasn't in the bed. I frantically swept the light across the room. He had crawled into the far corner. He was hunched on all fours, exactly like a predatory beast. Thick drool poured from his mouth as his fingernails gouged deep splinters out of the floorboards.
Suddenly, he snapped his head up. The yellow eyes practically glowed in the flashlight beam. With terrifying speed, he scuttled toward the window and grabbed the iron grates, shaking them violently. The strength he displayed was inhuman. The iron bars groaned as if they were about to snap. I yelled, "Hank, stop! What are you doing?" He didn't even look back at me. He just stared out into the pitch-black woods and whispered, "He is coming. The master is coming. Open the door. Open it." Outside, a violent storm seemed to erupt out of nowhere. The wind howled furiously, bringing with it that repulsive stench of decaying flesh. This time, the smell was so potent that holding a rag over my nose did nothing. It felt like the stench was seeping up through the floorboards themselves. I realized then that no doctor could fix this. This was entirely out of my control. I bolted for the front door to call Old Man Miller and the others for help. But as I pulled the door open, I froze dead in my tracks. Out in the yard, the exact spot where Hank had buried that thing was dug up. The hole was gaping wide, and leading from the hole directly to the porch were massive, wet footprints. They weren't human. They were elongated, and the toes were webbed together. The ground felt like it was crumbling beneath my feet. Miller was right. That wasn't a fish.
It was a trap. It was bait. And now that the bait had been taken, the hunter had come out of the water to collect his catch. Where could we possibly hide? I threw my weight against the door to slam it shut, but it wouldn't close. It felt like something massive was pushing against it from the outside. I shoved with all my might, but the force on the other side was immensely stronger. Just then, a blood-curdling scream erupted from the bedroom. Hank's wife shrieked, "Something's wrong! Help!" I abandoned the door and sprinted into the room. Hank's wife was on the floor. Hank was straddling her, his hands clamped tightly around her throat. She was kicking and thrashing to survive, but Hank's arms were like iron vices. Hellfire seemed to burn in his eyes. I grabbed a heavy wooden stool and swung it as hard as I could, cracking it against Hank's arm. He released her and slowly turned his head toward me. The look he gave me made me realize my death was standing right in front of me. As he stalked toward me, the dual voice echoed from his chest. "Do not interfere. If you stand in the way, we will drag you down too. We are coming, and we will come for you. You must come with us. Prepare yourself. You will not survive this night." I backed up until my spine hit the wall. There was nowhere to run. Hank reached out for me. His fingernails had turned pitch black and grown into sharp claws. Just as his hands lunged for my throat, I closed my eyes and began shouting a prayer to God at the top of my lungs. The moment the divine words filled the room, Hank froze in his tracks. His body violently convulsed. He grabbed the sides of his head and collapsed, rolling on the floor in agony, as if an invisible fire was scorching his skin. A thick black fluid began spewing from his mouth, filling the room with the stench of bile and swamp muck. Even when dawn finally broke, the terror refused to let go. Hank was completely unconscious. We moved him to the porch, laying him on a woven mat. His breathing was frighteningly shallow. He was barely holding on to life. A few of us carried him back inside, but as we laid him down, we noticed something impossible. Water was continuously seeping out of Hank's pores. We kept wiping him down with dry towels, but minutes later, his skin would bead up with droplets of water again. It was as if his body had become a clay pot, and the water inside was sweating through the exterior. By 10 in the morning, the weather deteriorated further. The fog was so dense, you couldn't see a person standing 5 feet away. I rushed to the docks to hire a skiff or a motorboat to evacuate him to the mainland, but all the local boatmen were sitting idle on the pier. No one was willing to unmoor. When I desperately asked why, an old fisherman leaned in and whispered, "Brother, there ain't no storm coming, but the water is furious. The lake turned black today. Anyone who sets sail today ain't coming back." I walked back, completely hopeless. We were trapped on this isolated island. There was no escape. The cell service was completely dead, so I couldn't even call for help. A profound sense of isolation swallowed me whole. It felt as if we had been cut off from the rest of the world and trapped in a hellish parallel dimension. After midday, Hank finally opened his eyes, but his waking was not a good sign. As he stared up, we saw his pupils furiously darting back and forth like the pendulum of a clock. He was rapidly muttering under his breath, I leaned in to listen. He was repeating, "Water.
Give me more water. I'm drying up. Soak me. Pour water on me. Throw me in the lake." His terrified wife brought a tall glass of water to his lips. Hank, or the thing wearing him, downed the entire glass in a single gulp. Then he demanded more. 1 pitcher, 2 pitchers. He drank pitcher after pitcher of water, but his stomach didn't distend an inch. It was as if the water wasn't going into his stomach at all, but vanishing into some bottomless void inside him. Late afternoon bled into evening. That was when Elias the occultist returned. He brought 2 of his apprentices with him. He carried a heavy satchel filled with ancient grimoires and protective talismans. He signaled for me to step outside. His face was grim. Elias said, "Son, I performed a spiritual divination. The omens are terrible. What's got a hold of Hank isn't a wandering ghost. It is an ancient, elemental demon, a king of the deep waters. They are incredibly powerful and utterly ruthless. I will try my best, but I cannot guarantee he will survive. Only God can decide who lives and dies. I will use the divine words as a weapon, but the rest is up to the Creator." I said, "Elias, do whatever you have to do. Please, save him." Elias nodded. "We will begin the ritual once night fully falls, but hear me clearly. Shut every window tight, and no matter what happens, no one leaves this room, and no one extinguishes the lights." It was 9 o'clock. Outside it was a wall of blackness. Lightning occasionally illuminated the horrifying shapes of the woods through the rusted window grates. We sat in a circle in the center of Hank's room. Elias and his apprentices sat near the bed. Hank had been bound to the heavy wooden bed frame with thick ropes because he had turned violent again in the late afternoon. Elias slowly began reciting ancient incantations of banishment. For the first few minutes, everything was still, just the deep resonance of his voice and the howling wind outside. But as the 10-minute mark passed, the atmosphere warped. First came the stench, that vile mixture of rotting fish and burnt iron. It was so potent I felt my lungs were rotting from the inside out. Then came the tremors. The heavy bed frame began shaking violently. Hank squeezed his eyes shut. When they snapped open, they were a blazing, fiery yellow. He locked eyes with Elias and let out a shriek so deafening that the tin roof rattled furiously. Then, that demonic, overlapping voice tore out of Hank's throat. It was no longer whispering, it was openly threatening. "You came back? Do you want to die the same way your father died? We dragged him into the deep. Are you ready to drown too? If you value your life, run. Run now. If you stay, we will send you to the bottom of the lake with him tonight." Elias did not falter. He raised his voice, reading the incantations louder. Sweat poured down his face. He grabbed a vial of purified, blessed water and splashed it across Hank's chest. The moment the water made contact, it hissed like oil in a hot pan. Hank writhed in unimaginable agony. Smoke began curling off his skin. He shrieked, "It burns! It burns! I will not let you live. I will turn this entire town into a graveyard. I will bury every soul here at the bottom of the lake." From the corner of the room, a glass cabinet shattered with an explosive crash.
Steel cups, pitchers, and heavy objects levitated off the tables and hurled themselves across the room at us like projectiles. A jagged shard of glass clipped my arm, drawing blood. I cowered in the corner in sheer terror. Elias commanded over the chaos. "Do not fear. Keep your faith in God strong." Elias then began loudly invoking the names of the Creator, projecting his voice over the storm. Hearing the divine names, Hank's body arched backwards. The sickening crunch of his bones snapping echoed over the wind. It sounded as if an invisible giant was taking a sledgehammer to his joints. Suddenly, Hank went completely limp. He crashed back onto the mattress. He looked at Elias with tears in his eyes and pleaded in a pitiful, trembling voice, "Help me, please. God, help me. They're taking me. Don't let them take me to the water. I don't want to die. Save me. Please, save me." It was Hank. It was his real voice. He was sobbing. But a second later, his expression violently twisted. The sinister grin returned. He slowly turned his head to look directly at me. The look in his yellow eyes told me that the real game had just begun. The deep voice rumbled, "We demand a sacrifice. We demand an offering. He is mighty." In that horrific moment, everything clicked into place. The 3 triangular wounds on Hank's ankle, it wasn't a bite mark. It was a seal, a brand. Old Man Miller's story of Robert made sense now. Robert brought back the stone. Hank brought back the fish. My blood ran ice cold. That monstrosity in the boat was never an animal. It was a prison.
For centuries, a cursed abyssal entity had been locked inside that flesh and dumped at the bottom of the lake. When Hank pulled it ashore, the seal was broken. The moment the vessel died, the entity was freed and latched on to Hank. But it didn't just want a temporary host. It wanted to be reborn. It needed a body it could consume completely. Elias must have realized it too. He shouted, "What is your name? Reveal yourself. Who are you?" Black fluid began pouring continuously from Hank's body. It leaked from his nose, his eyes, his mouth, running down his neck. He stared at Elias and uttered a name I had never heard in my life. But the second the syllable left his mouth, the kerosene lantern instantly blew out. From the absolute darkness, the voice boomed, "I am the Leviathan, the Abyssal King. This vessel is mine." Suddenly, I felt the floor beneath my boots getting soaked. I clicked my flashlight on. Dark, foul-smelling water was rapidly rising through the floorboards. Within seconds, it was pooling around our ankles. Elias panicked. "Run! Everyone run! We cannot hold him! Get out and save yourselves!" But we couldn't escape. The door was jammed shut, and the ropes binding Hank had effortlessly snapped. Hank slid off the bed and stood barefoot in the rising water. He looked impossibly tall. I watched in absolute horror as the human skin on his arms and face began to peel and slough off like wet paper. Underneath, there was no human muscle. There were thick, black, glistening scales. His arms elongated, and thick webbing grew between his fingers. He stalked right up to me. I was pinned against the wall. He leaned his horrifying face inches from mine and hissed, 13 years ago, your brother died. He was murdered. Do you want to join him?" I was paralyzed with confusion. I don't have a brother. But an instant later, I realized it was a trick.
The demon was probing my mind, trying to break my sanity with lies. I silently repeated a prayer to the Almighty in my head. In that split second of distraction, Elias swung his heavy grimoire and smashed it directly into the back of Hank's head. Hank spun around, his clawed hand reaching out to rip Elias's throat out, but Elias ducked just in time. Elias roared, "In the name of God the Almighty," and hurled a specialized vial of highly purified water directly into Hank's face. The moment it made contact, smoke violently erupted from Hank's flesh. He let out a shrieking wail that sounded like 100 emergency sirens going off at once. His body literally began to melt. Just like wax held to a flame, his arms, his legs, his face, everything began dissolving into sludge. His final, echoing words were, "I will return. As long as there is water, I will remain." Before our eyes, what was left of Hank completely collapsed. His empty overalls and a puddle of dissolving gore were all that remained on the bed. The foul water flooded the floor, instantly evaporated. The front door blew open with a deafening crash, letting the freezing winter wind howl into the cabin. We stood there, utterly paralyzed. Hank was gone. He didn't vanish into thin air. He didn't just turn into water. He had been transformed into something that human words cannot accurately describe. Officially, the town ruled Hank as a missing person. None of the locals raised a fuss. Everyone knew the horrifying truth, but no one dared speak of it. I gave his wife and daughter some money to survive. I know it won't erase the nightmare, but my conscience demanded I help them, and I still send what I can. I didn't stay a moment longer. I quit my job that very day and moved back to Boston. But I have never been able to forget what happened. Even today, when I step into the shower or pour myself a glass of water, I imagine those two glowing, yellow eyes staring back at me from the surface. In the dead of night, I hear the sound of dripping water. Drip, drop. I lie awake, terrified that the Abyssal King is coming back to drag me down. I still don't understand why he mentioned a brother. I don't know if he will return for me, or when, or who he will take next. But I know for a fact that the black waters of Blackwood Lake are waiting patiently for their next bait to be taken. With that, Richard concluded his story. We sat in silence for a long time at the diner table. His hands were still trembling. I noticed the cold sweat beading on his forehead again. When we stepped out of the diner, a light drizzle had begun to fall. Richard looked up at the rain and visibly, violently shuddered. I drove him home safely. I never saw him in person again after that. I heard he moved out of the country to undergo intense psychological therapy. We exchange messages occasionally, but never face to face. Some horrors leave scars on the human mind that are simply too deep to heal. Richard's story is the living proof of that.